Imagine waking up every morning with a feeling you cannot name. A heaviness in your chest. A tightness that never quite leaves. A quiet dread sitting in the background of everything you do. You don't know where it came from. You can't explain it to the people who love you. You've tried to forget it. You've tried to move past. And yet it stays. Some people spend decades trying to understand why they feel the way they feel. Certain sounds make their heart race. Why certain faces make them want to disappear. Why some nights the past feels more real than the present. What if I told you that the answer isn't in your thoughts? What if the deepest wounds you carry are not stored in your memories, but in your muscles, your nervous system, and your very cells? What if the body never forgot? This is not a metaphor. This is not poetry. This is science. And it is about to change the way you understand yourself and every human being who has ever suffered. Today, we are going inside one of the most groundbreaking books ever written about the human mind. A book that took over 30 years of clinical research, thousands of patients, and one man's relentless determination to finally understand the deepest question in psychology. How does trauma shape us? And how do we heal? The book is called The Body Keeps the Score, and it was written by Dr. Besselvanderkolk. If you have ever felt stuck, if you have ever felt like your past is controlling your present, if you have ever felt like something is broken inside you that no one can seem to fix, this book was written for you. Stay with me, because what you are about to discover will change the way you see yourself forever. Besselvanderkolk did not set out to become one of the world's leading experts on trauma. He was born in the Netherlands in 1943, just 2 years before the end of World War II. He grew up in a family that, like millions of European families, carried the silent weight of the war years. People did not talk about what they had been through. The unspoken pain simply lived in the house, in the long silences at dinner, in the tension that hung in there. As a young man, Vanderkolk came to the United States to study psychiatry. He was brilliant, curious, and drawn to the people who confused everyone else, the patients, who didn't fit the standard diagnoses, the ones who were labeled as difficult or untreatable, the ones who kept falling apart no matter what medication they were given. In the 1970s, he began working with Vietnam War veterans at the Boston Veterans Administration, and what he found there shook him to his core. These men had come home from war. The war was over. They were physically safe. Yet they were not free. They had nightmares so vivid they would wake up swinging their fists. They heard sounds in the middle of a quiet afternoon, a car backfiring, a child screaming, and in a fraction of a second, their bodies would react as if they were back in the jungle, as if the bullets were real, as if the danger had never ended. Their minds knew they were home, but their bodies refused to believe it. And Besselvanderkolk asked the question that would define the rest of his life. Why? Why does the body keep reacting as if the trauma is still happening? That question led him on a 30-year journey through neuroscience, psychology, clinical research, and the raw, human experiences of thousands of trauma survivors. And the answers he found became this book. To understand trauma, we first need to understand how the brain responds to fear. And here is where things get fascinating. Your brain is not one unified structure. It is more like 3 interconnected systems that evolved over millions of years, and they do not always agree with each other. The first system is the most ancient part of your brain. Scientists sometimes call it the reptilian brain or the brain stem. This part does one thing. It keeps you alive. It controls your heart rate, your breathing, your hunger, your reflexes. It doesn't think. It doesn't reason. It simply reacts. The second system sits on top of that. The limbic system. This is the emotional brain. The brain that feels fear, love, anger, grief. The brain that recognizes danger before your conscious mind does. The part that makes your stomach drop when you sense something is wrong. And sitting at the very front, the most recently evolved part of your brain, is the prefrontal cortex. This is the thinking brain, the part that plans, reasons, makes decisions, and most importantly, tells the rest of your brain, calm down, everything is okay, we are safe. Now, under normal circumstances, these three systems work together beautifully. Sense danger, your emotional brain sounds the alarm, and your thinking brain evaluates the situation and decides how to respond. But trauma changes this system. When something truly terrifying happens to you, something overwhelming, something that makes you feel like you might die or lose everything, your brain enters a state of emergency that goes far beyond normal fear. The limbic system floods your body with stress hormones, your heart pounds, your muscles tense, your vision narrows. You are ready to fight or run for your life. This is the survival response, and it is extraordinary. But here is where trauma becomes something very different from ordinary fear. In a traumatic event, especially one that is prolonged, inescapable, or happens in childhood, the thinking brain essentially goes offline. The prefrontal cortex, the part of you that can say, "It's okay, it will be over soon, going to survive this," it becomes muted, quieted, overwhelmed, and you are left with nothing but raw, physical terror. No words, no narrative, no sense of time or beginning or end. Just the body flooded with alarm, responding to a threat that feels absolutely real and absolutely endless. This is the core of trauma, not the memory itself, but what happens to the body and brain when memory can no longer be processed. And here is the most important thing Kolk discovered through his decades of research. The traumatic experience does not stay in the past. It gets stored in the body, in the nervous system, in the patterns of how we move, how we breathe, how we hold our muscles, how we respond to the world around us. The body keeps the score, even after the event is long over, even after time has passed, even when the conscious mind has done everything possible to forget. The body remembers. Kolk introduces us to some of his patients early in the book, and their stories are heartbreaking and illuminating in equal measure. Meet a man we'll call Tom. Tom was a Vietnam veteran, a decorated soldier, a man who by all outward appearances had rebuilt his life after the war. He had a job, he had a family, he went to church on Sundays. But Tom had not slept through the night since 1968. Every night, without fail, the nightmares came. And they weren't like ordinary nightmares that you know, somehow, aren't real. These nightmares were total re-experiences. Tom was back in Vietnam. He could smell the jungle. He could feel the heat. He could hear the helicopters and the screaming. And when he woke up, drenched in sweat, heart pounding, gasping, his body would take hours to calm down. Because to his nervous system, the war had never ended. Tom's mind knew the war was over, but his body had no idea. And here is what Kolk found extraordinary, and what the medical establishment of the time found almost impossible to accept. When Tom was experiencing these flashbacks, his brain was not simply remembering the past. It was reliving it. At a neurological level, the brain could not tell the difference between then and now. The survival systems were activating exactly as if the danger were present and real. The ordinary timeline of past and present had broken down. And Tom was not unusual. Kolk found this pattern again and again, not just in veterans, but in survivors of sexual assault, childhood abuse, accidents, natural disasters, medical trauma. Across cultures, ages, and life circumstances, trauma produced the same signature in the brain and body. The survival system, once triggered beyond its ability to process and recover, becomes stuck, like a car alarm that keeps going off even when there is no threat. And the tragedy, the profound, heartbreaking tragedy, is that trauma survivors often do not understand why they feel the way they feel. They know something is wrong. They know they are reacting too intensely, too unpredictably, too painfully, but they cannot explain it, and neither, for many years, could their doctors. One of the most groundbreaking sections of this book is Kolk's deep dive into the neuroscience of trauma. And I want to take you through this carefully, because what he discovered changes everything. In the 1990s, brain imaging technology advanced to the point where scientists could actually watch the brain in action. And van der Kolk and his colleagues began doing something extraordinary. They were scanning the brains of trauma survivors while triggering their traumatic memories. What they found was unlike anything they expected. When a trauma survivor was brought back to their traumatic experience, through a written script of the event read to them while they lay in a brain scanner, two things happened simultaneously. The first, the right side of the brain, which processes emotion and physical sensation, lit up dramatically, as if the experience were happening right now. The second, Broca's area, the region of the brain responsible for language, for turning experience into words, for telling the story of what happened, went quiet, almost completely silent. Think about what that means. When you relive trauma, the part of you that can put it into words, the part of you that can say, this happened, and then this happened, and it was terrible, but it ended, goes offline. You feel everything, but you cannot speak it. This is why trauma survivors so often say they can't explain what they went through, why they struggle to tell their stories, why therapy that is purely talk-based can be so limited in its effectiveness. Because the very machinery of language has been disrupted by the trauma itself. Van der Kolk writes, in order to change, people need to become aware of their sensations and the way that their bodies interact with the world around them. Physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. In other words, healing trauma is not just about understanding your past intellectually. It requires coming back into your body, feeling your feelings, learning to live in the present. Now here is where the story gets even deeper and more personal, because van der Kolk wasn't just studying veterans and accident survivors. He turned his attention to something even more pervasive, even more devastating: childhood trauma. And what he found there challenged everything the mental health profession thought it knew. In the late 1980s and 1990s, van der Kolk collaborated on one of the largest studies of adverse childhood experiences ever conducted, the ACE study, carried out with Dr. Vincent Felitti and Kaiser Permanente. This study surveyed over 17,000 adults about 10 categories of childhood trauma: physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, domestic violence, mental illness in the family, substance abuse, incarceration of a parent, and separation. The results were staggering. 2/3 of the people surveyed had experienced at least one category of childhood trauma, and more than 1 in 5 had experienced 3 or more. But what was even more shocking was what the researchers found when they looked at the long-term health outcomes of people who had experienced childhood trauma. The more adverse childhood experiences a person had, the higher their risk of not just psychological problems, but physical diseases: heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, autoimmune disorders, liver disease, chronic pain, obesity. Childhood trauma was not just a mental health issue. It was a public health crisis hidden in plain sight. But how does what happens to a child become disease in an adult body decades later? The answer comes back to the biology of stress. When a child is chronically frightened, when they grow up in a home where they never feel safe, where they never know if today will be the day the violence happens, or the neglect, or the cruelty, their stress response systems are constantly activated. The cortisol flooding their bloodstream day after day, year after year. The state of perpetual alarm. The nervous system that never gets to rest, never gets to recover, never gets to learn what safety actually feels like. This level of chronic stress physically changes the brain, especially in children whose brains are still developing. The hippocampus, which is essential for learning, memory, and telling past from present, actually shrinks under prolonged stress. The amygdala, which is the brain's alarm center, becomes hypersensitive. The connections between the emotional brain and the thinking brain weaken. A child who grows up in trauma doesn't just have bad memories. They end up with a brain that is fundamentally shaped by danger. A brain that is wired to expect the worst, to react before thinking, to interpret ambiguous situations as threats. And that brain does not simply reset when the child grows up and leaves the dangerous environment. The wiring follows them into their adult relationships, into their parenting, into their bodies, into their cells. Kolk shares the story of a woman, let's call her Marilyn. She was 42 years old when she first came to his clinic. She had a good job. She was articulate, intelligent, and deeply committed to her children. But she was, in her own words, falling apart. She had never been diagnosed with PTSD. She had never been in a war. She had never experienced what most people would call a single dramatic traumatic event. Instead, she had grown up with a mother who was profoundly depressed and emotionally unavailable, and a father who periodically raged and humiliated. There were no broken bones. No dramatic scenes that anyone outside the family would have called abusive. Just the slow, relentless erosion of a child's sense of safety. The message delivered 1,000 times in 1,000 ways. You do not matter. You are too much. You are a burden. Marilyn came to Kolk because she couldn't stop eating. She had struggled with binge eating since her teenage years, and no amount of insight, therapy, or willpower had ever been able to stop it. What Kolk helped her understand was this: the binge eating was not a character flaw. It was not weakness. It was her nervous system's desperate attempt to regulate itself, to find some relief from the constant low-grade state of alarm that had been with her since childhood. Food calmed her nervous system the way nothing else did. It was the one reliable source of comfort in a world that had always felt unreliable and unsafe. And this, Kolk argues, is at the heart of why trauma so often leads to addiction. Whether it is alcohol, drugs, food, sex, work, or any other compulsive behavior, these are not simply bad habits or moral failures. They are attempts at self-medication, ways that a dysregulated nervous system tries to find some peace. Until we understand that, we cannot really help people heal. This brings us to one of the most profound and controversial concepts in the book, the idea that trauma fundamentally changes the relationship between the self and the body. Many trauma survivors, and this may resonate with you in ways you didn't expect, develop a very complicated relationship with their own physical experience. Some of them become cut off from their bodies entirely. They walk through life feeling slightly unreal, as if they are watching themselves from the outside, as if they are a ghost in their own lives. This experience is called dissociation, and it is not, as it is sometimes portrayed, a rare or extreme phenomenon. It is incredibly common among trauma survivors, especially those whose trauma began in childhood. Think about what dissociation actually is. It is the mind's last resort survival mechanism. When something is happening that is too overwhelming, too painful, too threatening to process, the mind disconnects from the body. It finds a way to not be fully present for what is happening. In the moment of trauma, this is adaptive. It allows a child to survive something unsurvivable, to go to school the next day, to function, to continue. But the disconnection doesn't switch off when the danger is over. It becomes a pattern, a way of living, a kind of permanent absence from one's own experience. And here is the tragedy of that pattern. When you are disconnected from your body, you cannot access the very signals that would allow you to heal. You cannot feel the tension that tells you you're stressed. You cannot feel the tightening in your chest that signals fear. You cannot feel the warmth and safety of human connection because the physical experience of safety has become inaccessible to you. You are alive, but you are not fully inhabiting your life. Now let's talk about something that will feel uncomfortably familiar to many of you. The way trauma lives in the body is not always dramatic. It doesn't always look like a war veteran diving for cover when a car backfires. Sometimes it looks quiet, invisible even to the person carrying it. It looks like a woman who always holds her shoulders up near her ears, as if bracing for a blow that never comes. A man who cannot make eye contact, whose gaze drops automatically in the presence of authority. A child who freezes when a teacher raises their voice. It looks like chronic back pain that no physical cause can explain. Migraines that begin, always, in moments of relational conflict. A digestive system that shuts down under stress. It looks like chronic back pain that no physical cause can explain. Migraines that begin, always, in moments of relational conflict. A digestive system that shuts down under stress. Van der Kolk describes the work of a researcher named Peter Levine, who discovered that animals in the wild almost never develop trauma, even though they face life-threatening danger constantly. Think about that for a moment. A gazelle is chased by a lion. Its heart is pounding, its muscles are exploding with adrenaline, it is running for its life. If it escapes, if the lion turns away, the gazelle runs a little further, then stops. It stands still, and its body begins to shake, to tremble, to discharge the enormous energy of the survival response. And then it's over. The gazelle goes back to grazing. The nervous system completes its cycle. But humans, with our enormous, complex thinking brains, interfere with this process. We override it. We hold ourselves together. We tell ourselves to stop crying, to be strong, to keep it together. We judge the shaking as weakness. We suppress the trembling before it can complete its work. And the survival energy that was never discharged remains trapped in the body, building pressure, creating havoc. The medical establishment was, for most of van der Kolk's career, deeply resistant to these ideas. Psychiatry in the late 20th century had become dominated by the idea of the chemical brain. The idea that mental illness was primarily a matter of neurotransmitter imbalances to be corrected with medication. Talk therapy was tolerated, but the idea that trauma was stored in the body and that healing had to happen at the level of the body seemed strange, unscientific. Van der Kolk spent decades fighting for recognition. He founded the Trauma Center in Boston. He trained hundreds of therapists. He published landmark research. And he met resistance at every turn. But the science was on his side. Because as brain imaging technology advanced, as the neuroscience of trauma became clearer, as studies like the ACE study revealed the devastating long-term consequences of childhood adversity, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Trauma is real. It is biological. And it requires more than willpower to overcome. In fact, Van der Kolk makes a compelling and somewhat damning case that many traditional treatments for trauma are not just ineffective, they can actually make things worse. Talk therapy, as traditionally practiced, asks trauma survivors to revisit their experiences verbally, to narrate what happened, to analyze the story. But as we have seen, trauma disrupts the very language centers of the brain. Asking someone to talk about their trauma without first helping them regulate their nervous system can simply re-traumatize them, sending them back into that flooding, overwhelming state without any ability to process it. Medication can reduce some of the symptoms, the hyperarousal, the depression, the anxiety, but it doesn't address the underlying problem. It doesn't help the body feel safe. It just turns down the volume. And yet, for decades, these were the only tools the psychiatric establishment was willing to offer. But then Van der Kolk and his colleagues began discovering something remarkable. They began finding that interventions aimed at the body, at the physical, sensory experience of the trauma survivor, could produce changes that nothing else had. One of the first of these discoveries came through an approach called EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. Originally developed by Francine Shapiro in the late 1980s, EMDR involves guided eye movements while the patient holds traumatic memories in mind. When Van der Kolk's team first heard about it, many of them were skeptical. Moving your eyes while thinking about your trauma? It sounded absurd, like something from a stage hypnotist's act. But then they tried it, and they watched extraordinary things happen. Memories that had been frozen, preserved in their original terror, as vivid and overwhelming as the day they happened, began to change. Patients who had been stuck in the same narrative loop for years began to see their experiences differently. The emotional intensity decreased. The memory began to feel like something that happened, rather than something that is happening. But the theory, supported by research on what happens during REM sleep, when the eyes move rapidly, is that the bilateral stimulation mimics the brain's natural process of memory consolidation, the process by which ordinary experiences are integrated and stored as past, the process that trauma had disrupted. EMDR was helping the brain do what it had been unable to do on its own: file the traumatic memory into the past where it belonged. But van der Kolk found that there was something even more fundamental than the specific technique, something that was at the heart of every effective trauma treatment he encountered. That something was safety. Not just the idea of safety, the felt sense of safety, the physical, somatic experience of actually feeling safe in your body. Because here is what trauma does at its deepest level. It destroys the survivor's relationship with safety. It teaches the nervous system that the world is unpredictable and dangerous, that other people cannot be trusted, that the body itself is an unsafe place to be. And until a trauma survivor can rebuild that felt sense of safety, in their body, in their relationships, in the present moment, no amount of insight or analysis or medication will produce lasting change. This is why van der Kolk became increasingly interested in body-based approaches to healing. Approaches that worked below the level of thought, directly with the nervous system. He began exploring yoga. Not yoga as a fitness practice. Yoga as a tool for reconnecting with the body. For learning to notice physical sensation without being overwhelmed by it. For developing what researchers call interoceptive awareness, the ability to feel what is happening inside you. He ran a study on yoga and trauma with female survivors of chronic trauma, many of whom had been suffering for decades. The results were remarkable. 10 weeks of trauma-sensitive yoga produced significant decreases in PTSD symptoms, comparable to or better than some medications. But what was more important than the statistics were the stories the women told about what had changed. They had begun to feel at home in their bodies. For the first time in years, in some cases for the first time in their lives, they could feel their feet on the ground, their breath moving in and out, their muscles working and resting. They could feel alive without feeling afraid. Van der Kolk also became fascinated by a newer approach called neurofeedback, a form of biofeedback that allows people to see their own brain wave patterns in real time and learn, through the miracle of neuroplasticity, to change them. The idea sounds almost like science fiction. You sit in front of a screen. Electrodes are attached to your scalp, and you watch a computer game that responds to your brain waves. When your brain is in a calmer, more regulated state, you win. When you are in a hyper-aroused, dysregulated state, the game stops rewarding you. Over repeated sessions, the brain actually learns to prefer the more regulated state. The nervous system recalibrates. People who have spent years in a state of chronic hyperarousal begin to discover what calm feels like, not as an idea, but as a physical reality. For trauma survivors who have exhausted every other option, who have tried medication after medication, therapy after therapy, without sustainable relief, neurofeedback has sometimes produced changes that seemed impossible. Children who had been diagnosed with severe ADHD and learning disabilities, whose hyperactivity and attention problems turned out to be symptoms of unrecognized trauma, showed dramatic improvement. Veterans who had lived with PTSD for decades began sleeping through the night. The brain can change. The body can heal. But it requires the right kind of help. Now I want to talk about something that van der Kolk addresses with tremendous care and compassion, something that is perhaps the most painful aspect of trauma and the most misunderstood. The way trauma affects relationships. Human beings are fundamentally social creatures. We are wired for connection. Our nervous systems don't operate in isolation, they co-regulate, meaning we literally calm each other down and excite each other through our presence, our tone of voice, our facial expressions, our physical touch. A baby who is frightened needs to be held, soothed, and helped to calm down by a caregiver. Through that repeated experience of co-regulation, the child's nervous system learns to regulate itself. It learns, when I am distressed, I can reach out and safety will come to me. But when the caregiver is the source of threat, when the person the child depends on for safety is also the person who frightens, hurts, or abandons them, something terrible happens to the nervous system's relationship with other people. The child learns, the people I need are the people I fear. The people who are supposed to protect me are the people who hurt me. Safety and danger are the same thing. This is what researchers call disorganized attachment, and it is one of the most lasting and painful legacies of early trauma. Children who develop disorganized attachment grow up with a nervous system that is simultaneously hungry for connection and terrified of it. They crave closeness. They need love. And yet the closer someone gets, the more danger signals flood their body. In adult relationships, this can look like extraordinary things. A person who falls desperately in love, then sabotages the relationship when it becomes too intimate. A person who is simultaneously clinging and pushing away. A person who mistakes intensity, even painful intensity, for love. Kolk describes working with a woman who kept returning to an abusive partner despite knowing it was destructive. She knew intellectually that he was dangerous. She had tried to leave many times, and yet she found herself drawn back. What she came to understand in therapy was this. With this man, her body felt exactly as it had felt in childhood. The hyperarousal, the hypervigilance, the desperate hunger for his approval alternating with terror of his anger. It felt like home, not because it was good, but because it was familiar. The nervous system does not distinguish between safe familiarity and dangerous familiarity. It simply knows what it recognizes. And it tends to move toward what it recognizes, even when what it recognizes is pain. But here is where the story turns. This is where the profound hope of this book begins to open up. Because if trauma is stored in the body and the nervous system, then healing, too, must happen at the level of the body and the nervous system. And what neuroscience has shown us in the last 30 years is something extraordinary. The brain can change, at any age, under the right conditions. This is called neuroplasticity, and it means that the patterns laid down by trauma, the hyperactive alarm system, the weakened connections between thinking and feeling, the body that has forgotten what safety feels like, can be rewired. Not through willpower, not through analyzing your past, but through new experiences that reach the body and the nervous system directly. Kolk identifies several pathways to this kind of healing. Some are clinical interventions. Some are ancient practices that have existed for thousands of years, whose benefit science is only now beginning to understand. We've talked about EMDR and yoga. Let me take you deeper into a few others. The first is theater and movement. Kolk worked with a group called Urban Improv, which used theater exercises with troubled youth in inner-city schools. He also explored a practice called the trauma drama work of Dr. Adam Brown and the extraordinary theater program at the Shakespeare-infused work of the Trauma Drama Group. What theater does, particularly improvisational theater and embodied drama, is give people a safe container in which to experience and express emotions that their bodies have been carrying without permission. When you play a character, you can feel things that feel too dangerous to feel as yourself. When you play a scene of confrontation or grief or triumph, your body goes through the physical experience, the racing heart, the tears, the expansiveness of pride, in a context that is bounded, supervised, and safe. Over time, this teaches the nervous system that emotions can be felt without being dangerous, that the body can move through intensity and come out the other side, that you can be fully present in your physical experience without being destroyed by it. Another profound path of healing that Kolk explores is the cultivation of mindfulness. And by this he does not mean a vague instruction to live in the moment. He means something very specific and very powerful. Mindfulness, as Kolk uses it, means learning to observe your own internal experience with curiosity rather than judgment. Learning to notice what is happening in your body, the tightening in your chest, the holding of your breath, the tension in your jaw, without immediately trying to make it stop. This sounds simple. For trauma survivors, it is anything but, because for people whose bodies have become the site of terror, turning attention inward is itself threatening. The body is not a safe place. The body is where the trauma lives. Going toward it feels like walking back into the fire. But van der Kolk found, again and again, that this gentle, supported return to bodily awareness was essential for healing. Because you cannot change something you cannot feel. You cannot regulate something you are not present to. The goal is what he calls a therapeutic window. A zone where you can be in contact with difficult sensations and emotions without being overwhelmed by them. Not suppressing them. Not drowning in them. But accompanying them with curiosity and compassion. This is the work. Slow, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately transformative. Van der Kolk also speaks with deep feeling about the role of relationships in healing. Because, as he emphasizes repeatedly, trauma happens in a relational context. It is usually caused by what another human being did or failed to do. And so healing, too, must happen in a relational context. The therapeutic relationship itself is a vehicle for healing. When a trauma survivor experiences, perhaps for the first time in their life, what it feels like to be truly seen, to be heard without judgment, to be cared for by someone who is not afraid of their pain, who doesn't need them to be okay before they are ready to be okay. This experience of safe connection, of being held without being hurt, begins to recalibrate the nervous system's relationship with other people. It doesn't happen overnight. The nervous system needs repeated experiences of safety before it updates its priors. Before it can begin to believe, at a bodily level, that not everyone will hurt you. That connection can exist without danger. But it does happen. Van der Kolk has seen it happen. Over and over, across 30 years of clinical work. The most broken, the most damaged, the most untreatable patients, given the right conditions, the right relationships, the right interventions, can find their way back to themselves. Toward the end of the book, van der Kolk turns his attention to a question that I think many of you have been carrying through this whole journey. What does it mean to truly recover from trauma? What does healing actually look like? He is careful here. He does not promise that healing means forgetting. He does not promise that it means returning to who you were before. Trauma changes us. The question is whether it changes us in ways that destroy us, or in ways that ultimately deepen us. Recovery, van der Kolk says, means being able to have the memory without becoming the memory. It means feeling the grief of what happened without being consumed by it. It means being able to be fully present in your life, in your body, in your relationships, in this moment, without the past constantly pulling you back into its emergency. It means being able to look at what happened and say, that was real, that hurt me, and it does not define me. It means reclaiming the authorship of your own life. Van der Kolk writes about something he calls the capacity for self-observation, the ability to notice your own reactions, your own patterns, your own body signals, and to have some agency over how you respond. Not perfect control, but agency. The difference between being driven by your fear and being able to observe your fear from a place of witness. This capacity, which trauma takes away and which healing rebuilds, is what allows survivors to do something remarkable. It allows them to choose. Not to choose what happened to them, but to choose what they do with it. Some of the most compassionate human beings on earth are trauma survivors who have done the work of healing. Some of the most talented artists. Some of the most effective healers. The experience of profound suffering, processed and integrated, can become a doorway into extraordinary depth of empathy, creativity, and wisdom. There is one more thing I want to leave you with, and it is perhaps the most important thing in this entire book. Throughout all of his decades of research and clinical work, Bessel van der Kolk kept returning to the same fundamental insight about human beings. We are not meant to carry these burdens alone. The human nervous system evolved in the context of community, of being known by others, of being touched, held, regulated by the presence of people who love us. Our neurobiology is fundamentally social. And one of the deepest wounds of trauma, perhaps the deepest, is the isolation it creates. The shame that makes survivors feel like their experience is uniquely theirs, uniquely shameful, uniquely incomprehensible. The wall that goes up between the traumatized person and the rest of humanity. When that wall comes down, when a survivor finds, in whatever form it takes, a community of safety and understanding, something shifts that medication cannot produce and analysis cannot reach. You are not alone in what you carry. You are not broken. You are not a lost cause. You are a human being whose nervous system responded, as it was designed to respond, to unbearable circumstances. And your nervous system can learn. It can heal. It can update, given the right conditions. Given safety, given connection, given the patient, compassionate work of learning to be present in your own body again. That is the promise of this extraordinary book. We began this journey with a question. What if the pain you buried years ago is still controlling your life today? The answer, after everything besselvanderkolk has devoted his life to understanding, is this. Yes. It very likely is. Not because you are weak. Not because you haven't tried hard enough. But because trauma is not just a memory. It is a wound in the living tissue of your nervous system. And wounds can heal. Nervous systems can learn. Brains can change. Bodies can come home to themselves. The healing is not linear. It is not easy, it does not look the same for everyone. But it is possible, it is real. And it is within reach for every human being who has suffered. Because if there is one thing that 30 years of research, thousands of patients, and one man's extraordinary commitment to the truth has shown us, we are more resilient than our wounds. The body has kept the score for long enough. Now it is time to come home. If this journey moved you, if it gave you language for something you've been carrying, or helped you understand someone you love, please subscribe and share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you want to go deeper into this life-changing work, I highly encourage you to read The Body Keeps the Score yourself. The full book is a world unto itself. Until next time, take care of yourself. You matter more than you know.